Hi. Good morning, good afternoon, and if we have any friends joining us from Australasia, good evening. Thank you for joining us today for the second day of this Human Rights and Climate Change Symposium. My name is Tara Van Ho. I'm a lecturer in the School of Law and Human Rights Center here at the University of Essex, and one of the co-directors of the Essex Business and Human Rights Project, which works with states, intergovernmental organizations, and non-governmental organizations to address business impacts on human rights and the climate. I'd like to thank my colleague, Dr. Stephen Turner, for allowing me to be a part of this morning's session. In a small way, I'm just here to introduce today and to remind you of what today's sessions will look like and a preview for tomorrow. So today we have a session on Bhutan, then followed by a session on climate change, migration, and tribunals, from migration to litigation, and will courts save the day? We'll then move on to migration with dignity, perspectives on climate change and human mobility. I want to remind you about tomorrow's sessions as well, on energy provision in developing countries, climate change and the rights of the child, and new perspectives on the rights of nature. We want to give a special thank you from the University of Essex to our partnering organizations at the Environmental Law Institute in Washington, D.C., the University of Beirut in Germany, the University of East Anglia, our friends and neighbors here in the UK, in the US, and Widener University Delaware Law School, also in the US. I'd also like to give a special thank you to our technical lead, Sophie Conlin. Throughout all of the sessions today and tomorrow, please remember that we do have question and answer opportunities. You can use the Q&A box that's at the bottom of your screen. We do apologize in advance if we're unable to answer all of the questions, but we are hoping for a lively discussion, so we do hope that you fill up those boxes each session. Please note that the sessions are being recorded and they will be made publicly available on the Essex YouTube channel. Therefore, you can anonymize yourself in the list of attendees if you wish. If you want to do that, find yourself in the participant list and then use a change your name function or rename your function. It's now my pleasure to hand this over to Dr. Loveleen Bular from the University of Birmingham, who will chair the first session on Bhutan.
Thanks so much, Tara. Hello, everyone. A very warm welcome to all of you. It is my pleasure to chair this fantastic panel on the Kingdom of Bhutan. We are joined by three experts today. We have Dr. Kent Schroeder, Mr. Nima Dorji, and Mr. Navraj Chetri. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation and joining us. What I will do now is briefly introduce each of the speakers. So first, we will have Dr. Kent Schroeder, who has over 20 years of experience working on sustainable development initiatives across Asia, Africa, the Caribbean, Eastern Europe, and the Canadian Arctic. He has an interest in the political dynamics surrounding the implementation of alternative development models and the role of cultural values in shaping these dynamics. He is particularly interested in Bhutan's gross national happiness model and has worked on a number of initiatives in Bhutan since 2006. He is currently the executive director of the Bhutan Canada Foundation. Our second speaker will be Mr. Nima Dorji, who is a senior lecturer of comparative constitutional law and Bhutanese constitutional law at the Jigme Singye Wangchuk School of Law, the JSW School of Law in Bhutan. He is one of the founding faculty members of this first law school and also a PhD candidate at the University of Victoria in Canada. His research examines the intersection between law and happiness more generally, and in particular, the relationship between happiness and constitutionalism. Our final speaker is Mr. Navraj Chetri, who has been working with the UNDP Bhutan for the last 8 years as a portfolio analyst, supporting the Environment and Livelihood Unit. He has experience working on policies and strategies for transport, energy efficiency, and renewable energy. Each of our presenters has 20 minutes for their presentation. And after all the three presentations, we will open up the floor for the Q&A session. So please do make a note of your questions or your comments, or you can type them in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. And we will take up all these questions and comments after the three presentations. So without any further delay, I hand over the screen to Dr. Kent Schroeder. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Let me just get my screen up. Okay, well, good morning, everyone, and good afternoon to our friends joining us from Bhutan. I want to start with this photograph. So this is a photograph I took on, I think, one of my first trips to Bhutan, and I really like it because I think it encapsulates sort of the uniqueness of the country quite nicely. You can see the way people are dressed. You can see the traditional kind of architecture there. And I like this photo so much, I sent it to a colleague of mine, and he emailed me back and he said, wow, I really like that photo of Bhutan. I had no idea that's what parts of Africa looked like. And of course, I had a good chuckle at his inability to place it on the map correctly, but I think his response reflected a frequent understanding and a frequent misunderstanding, I think, of Bhutan. It's a sort of, excuse me, seemingly insignificant country that some people can't even seem to place on the map correctly. And I think, indeed, if you look at it on the surface, it may seem insignificant, right? It's a small country. It's 300 kilometers at its greatest length. Population figures vary, but it's somewhere around only 800,000 people. It's apparently the only country in the world without a traffic light. And as you can see here, it's bordered by two geopolitical giants, India and China. So, on the surface, it seems like this seemingly small, relatively unknown country that's, tucked into the Himalayas. Yeah, I would suggest that Bhutan is significant. And in fact, I would argue that it is globally significant because Bhutan, I think, is a leader in responding to the climate crisis. So this is a country that is carbon negative. So it's committed to being carbon neutral, but it is in fact carbon negative. And relatedly, over 70% of the country is forested. And as I think you'll hear in a subsequent presentation, it's actually entrenched in the Bhutanese constitution that at least 60% of the country has to be forested at all times in perpetuity. Similarly, over half of the country is considered protected areas or designated as protected areas. So you have this very sort of long history of strong conservation in the country, excuse me, as well as positively responding to climate change. Now, paralleling this is, I think, what we can suggest is real significant economic progress. So World Bank figures show an average of 7.5% annual economic growth over the past few decades in Bhutan. And poverty has been reduced from 36% to 8% since 2004. So I think Bhutan has some really significant development achievements. And not only that, it balances sort of significant advances and gains when it comes to environmental and ecological issues, but also issues related to economic growth. Now, that's not to say there's no development challenges in Bhutan, because there certainly are. There's issues with youth unemployment. There's a need to further diversify the economy. There's a legacy of an ethnic conflict from the 1990s. But clearly, when you look at climate issues and Bhutan's response to climate issues and many other development issues, Bhutan seems to be doing something very, very interesting, right? Here we have this small country that's carbon negative. It also has some significant economic growth. So I want to spend my time today looking at why Bhutan has this focus and how it makes public policy decisions that lead it to take this kind of leadership role, particularly around climate. And I'll do this as an outsider with an eye to what we outside of Bhutan can potentially learn from its experience. Now, the heart of what I want to speak about is gross national happiness, or GNH. And GNH is Bhutan's national development strategy. It's a holistic, multidimensional model of development that is very explicitly rooted to Bhutanese values and Bhutanese culture. And it understands that development, or the nature of the good life, is about more than economic growth. It's about more than the accumulation of wealth. GNH certainly doesn't discount economic growth, but it's not an end in itself. It's not the end goal of development. Rather, GNH balances material and non-material concerns. And this balancing of the material and the non-material, that is the foundation for happiness, which from a GNH perspective, happiness is understood as this, realizing one's full potential as a human being, inherently interconnected with society, and including past and future generations, and also interconnected with the environment. That's the nature of happiness as understood in GNH. Now, GNH was initially conceptualized as 4 pillars. You can see on the left of the slide there, those are the original 4 pillars. More recently, it was expanded into 9 domains on the right there. So the domains just simply break out the 4 pillars into a further set of categories. And these are the material and the non-material concerns that promote happiness in Bhutan. Okay, this is specific to Bhutan's cultural context. And as you can see there, they rest on a foundation of values, things like interdependence, harmony, balance, and dignity. And in my own research, Bhutanese will call these values different things. Some call them Bhutanese values, some call them Buddhist values, others call them Buddhist Hindu values. But what's key is that they're very much understood as local values. These are our cultural values of Bhutan. Now, originally, G&H was designed as a philosophical guide to development. But at the sort of after the turn of the millennium, there was a move to turn G&H from a philosophical guide to an applied development model. And so what you have is the creation of a set of G&H governance bodies and G&H tools that are meant to shape policy decisions so they foster G&H. So you have a public decision-making model meant to be multidimensional and integrated. So here's a list of bodies and tools, G&H-related bodies and tools in Bhutan. I won't go through all of these. I'll focus on the first three in particular, and they will give you a sense of this sort of multidimensional and integrated approach to decision-making that I think leads to decisions that lead to things like being carbon negative. So first you have the G&H Commission, or GNHC. And this is the apex body for implementing G&H in the country. This is the former Planning Commission. And it ensures that G&H is mainstreamed into all policies, all plans, and all projects in the country. And this includes all levels. So this is at the central government level, this is at the district government level, and also the village block level. It ensures that all policies and plans at those levels are shaped by G&H or foster G&H. And it also ensures that donor initiatives are shaped or consistent with G&H, and particularly those 9 domains. The G&H Commission is chaired by the Prime Minister. The Vice Chair is the Minister of Finance. And then there's the secretaries of all the individual ministries make up the commission. And then there's a secretariat that carries out the work. So it does a whole number of things. Again, its key is to infuse G&H into all policy and planning. I'll just mention one quickly. It's responsible for overseeing the development of a 5-year plan. And the 5-year plan is a set of development plans that occur at the local level, among village blocks, all the way up to the ministerial level at the central government. And so the G&H Commission ensures that every plan that is created over a 5-year period, every development plan, is focused on achieving or contributing to those 9 domains of G&H. Second, there you see the G&H Index. And I think this is the most well-known policy tool. Many people actually equate the G&H Index with G&H as a whole. And this is a measurement tool that can be used to evaluate policy outcomes. It can be used to inform policy formulation. And this is composed of the 9 domains. Again, on the right there, those are the 9 domains. So the index is composed of these 9 domains. They are measured through 33 different indicators, and those are further disaggregated into over 120 variables. And so, data is collected using this index, and the results are clustered into a single aggregate measure of G&H. So national G&H, a single measurement. It's between the numbers between 0 and 1. It's similar to the Human Development Index. But it's also decomposable to enable comparisons across districts, across gender, age, other sorts of things. And every 5 years or so, there's a G&H survey that's carried out nationally using this index, and it collects all of that data to get a measurement of the nature of G&H happiness in the country. And just to give you a sense, the last one of some of the findings, the last one that occurred, I think one of the interesting findings of many is that across those 9 domains, women do more poorly than men in every single case. So of course you have some learning there that can be used for not only to evaluate policies, but to design it. On the screen there is the G&H policy screening tool, and you'll hear more about this in the subsequent presentation as well. All policy in Bhutan must be screened with this tool to ensure that every policy is consistent with G&H and contributes to those 9 domains. And this is part of a larger policy formulation protocol. I won't talk about the whole protocol, but I'll look at specifically what the role that the screening tool plays. So a government ministry will submit a proposed policy to the G&H Commission Secretariat. And then as part of that submission, it also submits the results of the proposed policy after it's been put through this G&H policy screening tool. And I'll show you the tool in a minute. At the same time, the G&H Secretariat also submits the policy to the screening tool. So there's 2 processes going on. Both the ministry responsible for the policy and the G&H Commission Secretariat use this tool and put the policy through the tool. And the policy must reach a quantitative threshold to pass this screening tool. And if it does, the Secretariat of the G&H Commission passes it up to the Commission itself, and the Commission then submits it to Cabinet, where it's either approved or it's discussed and further revisions are suggested. So the intent here is that all policy, whether it's a climate change policy or a sexual violence policy or a mining policy, all of them must pass through this tool to ensure consistency with those 9 domains of G&H. So what does this tool look like? First, to comment on the actual screening process. So again, remember there's 2, the Ministry and the GNHC both carry out the process. But the screening involves a minimum of 15 people, and these have to represent diverse stakeholders, and you have to have people with expertise in things like gender, environment, and other areas related to the particular policy. Now, the tool itself, the tool has changed a little bit. I'll show you the revised 2015 tool. But the tool itself is made up of 22 questions, and these 22 questions are based on those 9 G&H domains. And here's a sample of 2 of the 22 questions. Okay, so the first one there is the first question. It's on equity of income distribution. I just picked these randomly. The second question is number 19 of the 22. It's on culture. And so what happens if you take, for example, a climate change policy, it has to be put up against each one of these questions. So if we take the first one on equity, I would ask yourself, this group of 15 people involved in this, will this climate policy negatively impact the equity of income distribution? If that's the case, you assign it a value of 1. You ask, do you know the differential effects on equity of income distribution? Or do you not know? So if you don't know the impact on equity, you give it a 2. If there won't be any sort of negative impact on equity of a policy, like a climate change policy, you give it a 3. And then if it has a positive impact on equity, you give it a 4. Okay, so you rank it between 1 and 4. 1 is negative impact, 2 is don't know the impact, 3 is neutral impact, and 4 is positive. So you give it a score, write a rationale in the box for why you awarded that score. And if it's below 2, you need to give an alternative or mitigation strategy. And again, you do that for all 22 questions. So again, once you get to question 19, in the example here, you would ask, does, for example, a climate change policy, does it have a negative impact on culture? Do you not know the impact on culture? Is there a neutral impact, or is there a positive impact? So you could, excuse me, you do that for all 22 questions here. You can see on the left, those are the 22 questions under the variables section there. You see number 1 is equity. So again, you go through all of those and you rank each one from 1 to 4, put it in the second column there. And then you'll see they are categorized by G&H domain. So the first 4 variables, or the first 4 questions, are all related to the living standard domain. So you would come up with an average score from those 4 questions and put it in the G&H domain score. Do that for each of the 9 domains there on the second last column to the right. And then you would add all of those up, and that would be your G&H score. And the policy has to reach what's called a neutral score, which is the equivalent of achieving a 3 out of 4 on all of those 22 questions. So if you achieve that neutral score, it will then go on to cabinet. If it doesn't, you need to revise the policy. So again, a very, very simple policy tool. I don't want to suggest this is any sort of policy formulation panacea, but this is a very simple tool that ensures every policy accounts for the 9 domains of G&H. So again, a climate policy, and there's a climate policy from 2020, went through this, and it would have had to account for not only its ecological impacts and its economic impacts, but its potential impacts on gender, on culture, on leisure time. So a very interesting set of multiple dimensions that it has to account for. There's a few other tools. I won't go through them. There's a project selection tool that is very much like this. It's meant to be used in the policy implementation stage when you are implementing policies. There also used to be something called G&H committees. They don't exist anymore, but they used to be within ministries, within local governments, and they were meant to oversee policy implementation and project implementation to ensure it's consistent with G&H. So let me just summarize to this point. G&H is Bhutan's national development strategy. It's a multidimensional and integrated conceptualization of development that balances the material with the non-material. It more recently includes this set of G&H bodies and tools that are meant to guide decision-making. And then all of this rests on a foundation of Bhutanese values that emphasize things like interdependence, harmony, and balance. So I think when development is understood and when it's pursued through this G&H framework and using a G&H lens, it seems to make sense that Bhutan has played the role it has in response to the climate crisis. in that climate and environmental concerns are an inherent part of G&H development itself, right? And they are seen as interdependent with all aspects of human existence. Ultimately, though, I want to raise a question. Can we say that policy outcomes like the carbon negative outcome, is the G&H framework actually responsible for these kinds of policy outcomes? And I think the answer is yes, but it's actually a little bit complicated. Some of my past research has shown that there are several challenges on the ground when actually implementing G&H in Bhutan. I'll just go through these very, very quickly. The first one for me was actually quite surprising, and that is that not all policy actors actually understand G&H. There's a few quotations from policy actors here. And so the very people who are charged with formulating policies and implementing policies and evaluating policies, not all of them necessarily understand what G&H is, as I think these quotations demonstrate quite vividly. And this is further complicated by the fact that the G&H tools that I've talked about, they're not always used consistently. So here's another couple of quotations. And this is particularly the case at the policy implementation level. So the project screening tool doesn't seem to be used often. People don't necessarily use the results of the G&H index to inform some of their policies decisions. So there's a bit of a challenge that emerges here, right? You have G&H and a set of G&H tools, but not everyone uses the tools, and not everyone even understands G&H itself. And yet, what some of my past research has shown is where there are challenges, something else fills the void. So recall that G&H is built on a foundation of Bhutanese values. So even if policy actors don't understand G&H or don't use the G&H tools, they're making policy decisions based on these shared values. So values like harmony, interdependence, and balance. And these shared values shape decision-making. And I don't think that's surprising at all. But they are shaping decision-making in a way that is consistent with G&H, because G&H itself is explicitly constructed on these values. So policy actors are engaging in G&H decisions, even if they don't know what G&H is, or if they're not using the G&H tools. So in the end, you often get policy outcomes that reflect G&H, such as this pursuit of being carbon negative. Let me just end quickly with a brief reflection on what we outside of Bhutan might take away from this, and we can talk more about this in the Q&A if interested. So I think for me, the main question is G&H replicable elsewhere? And I think in terms of those G&H bodies and those G&H tools that I spoke about, I think the answer is yes. These are absolutely replicable. And obviously similar things exist elsewhere. There are certainly many multidimensional indices of well-being that exist out there already. I think one of the things we can learn from Bhutan, though, is extending those kinds of tools, those multidimensional kinds of tools across the policy cycle. So many of the tools that you'll see outside of Bhutan that are multidimensional, those are related to policy evaluation. Those are indices of measurement. But I think what Bhutan has done is created tools and bodies, from the G&H Commission to the screening tool to some of those other things, that cross policy formulation through policy implementation and evaluation. I think that's one thing we can learn. So I think those tools are replicable, but they need to be adapted to their political and to their cultural context. And I think this raises the final question. Will these tools be applied as effectively in other contexts with different value sets? So remember, G&H values are things like harmony, balance, and interdependence. And these are the starting point. So the starting point of these values is that my well-being is inherently interconnected to the environment and a healthy climate, just as my well-being is also inherently interconnected to equitable economic development. And I think in my own context here in Canada, I think about some of our own policy debates, particularly around things like carbon pricing or oil pipelines. And I think it's safe to say that that's not our starting point. We're not starting from a collective understanding of interdependence in the way Bhutanese are. I think we're discussing these policy issues through a different set of values, where things that we value are things like freedom, individuality, and independence. So in such a context, I think adapting and using G&H and its tools may look different in practice when we're applying these within to things like climate policy. And I'm not suggesting here that different value sets, one value set is better than the other. I'm just suggesting they are different with implications for how we apply them. So I think there's real value in looking at Bhutan's G&H experience and how its G&H tools might be replicated. But this requires, I think, purposeful attention be paid to the values that underlie an adapted version of G&H and its tools, and how they might be operationalized effectively to promote a more holistic and integrated approach to climate issues and other development issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kent. That was extremely interesting. You explained G&H, the tools that are relevant, the challenges and the roles of value in overcoming some of those challenges. And of course, ending on a fairly optimistic note in terms of replicability. That's always kind of good to hear in conversations on climate change. So I'm going to carry on now and request Mr. Nima Dorji to take the floor now.
Thank you so much, Loveleen. With that, I'll try to screen share. All right. Very warm greetings from Bhutan to everyone. And I would like to thank organizers for inviting me to speak at this conference. For today, I'll be basically talking about constitutionalization of environmental and ecological care from G&H perspective. And I've not talked much on G&H per se, but try to look at the domains and pillars of G&H, whether that those domains and indicators and pillars are incorporated in Constitution or not. So in my presentation, what I'll basically look at is whether the Constitution of Bhutan constitutionalizes G&H framework more generally, and then in particular look at whether the Constitution of Bhutan incorporates principles and values that contribute to environmental and ecological care. And if time permits, I'll briefly talk about the relationship between climate change and ecological care from Bhutanese perspective. To start with the constitutionalization of G&H framework, in terms of what Dr. Ken talked about, like how G&H framework work, that particular framework, I mean, is not explicitly mentioned in the Bhutanese constitution. The only direct mention about G&H can be found in Article 9, Section 2 of the Constitution, which states that the state shall strive to promote those conditions that will enable the pursuit of gross national happiness. However, there are numerous provisions under the Constitution that can be connected to pillars, domains, and indicators of G&H, though there is no specific reference of their connection made to the G&H in the Constitution particularly. So as Dr. Kent mentioned earlier, so when we talk about G&H, we talk about 4 pillars, 9 domains, and 33 indicators and variables that are there under each indicators to measure G&H. So this diagram particularly shows the 9 domains and 33 indicators of G&H that are used to measure gross national happiness in Bhutan. So now looking at whether Bhutanese constitution constitutionalized G&H framework or not, particularly I look at 2 questions: whether a constitution adopts recognize 4 pillars and 9 domains. So the first questions I'm trying to answer in this particular presentation is whether the constitution adequately constitutionalizes these 4 pillars or not. And when we talk about 4 pillars, we talk about sustainable and equitable socioeconomic development. There are various provisions there in the constitution that can be connected to this pillar. And some examples are Article 920, which mandates state to create conditions that will enable the true and sustainable development of a good and compassionate society rooted in Buddhist ethos and universal human values. And when we talk about Article 5, Section 2, subsection C, it basically talks about securing ecologically balanced sustainable development while promoting justifiable economic and social development. So these 2 provisions are directly connected to this particular pillar. And there is also overarching provision that can be applied to these pillars and other pillars as well. That is Article 9, Section 2, which I earlier mentioned, talks about the responsibility of government to promote those conditions that would allow citizens to pursue gross national happiness. So these pillars as part of GNH, therefore, can be constituted as included in the Constitution. In terms of environmental protection, there's a particular article or the provision in Constitution, that is Article 5, which broadly sort of confers duty on both individuals and the state to protect and preserve natural environment and also prevent ecological degradation. And Article 8, Section 2 specifically confers fundamental duties upon all citizens to preserve, protect, and respect environment. So this particular pillar is also sort of covered by the Constitution. And when we talk about preservation and promotion of culture pillars of GNH, there is particular provision on culture, that is Article 4, where states is required to contribute to preservation and promotion of culture, and Article 8, Section 2 talks about individuals or the citizens' fundamental duty to preserve and promote and also respect culture. In terms of governance, good governance pillar of gross national happiness, there's lots of mentions about good governance in Constitution in particular, and also there are lots of literature that talks about why the reason for Bhutan transitioning into democratic constitutional governance is also to ensure good governance pillar of GNH. And in terms of constitutional provisions, there are some provisions that particularly talks about good governance. For instance, Article 20, Section 1 requires executive government to ensure good governance, and Article 26, Section 4 talks about the role of the Civil Service Commission to ensure high standard of ethics and integrity in promoting good governance and social justice, in implementing the policies and programs of good government, of the government. And there are other provisions as well. For example, Article 15.1 particularly talks about role of political parties in ensuring good governance, and Article 18.1 talks about the role of opposition party in playing a constructive role to ensure that government and the ruling party function in accordance with the provision of this constitution to provide good governance and strive to promote the national interest and also fulfill the aspiration of people. So if you look at this, some of these provisions, I would conclude that Bhutanese constitution recognizes these important 4 pillars of GNH. And now moving on to whether constitution incorporates 9 domains of GNH. Dr. Kent talked about this in particular earlier, so I'm not going to explain what health and time use and this other domains are, but basically look at whether constitution recognizes or incorporates those domains in constitution. In terms of health, there is a particular provision, that is Article 9, Section 21, which talks about providing free access to basic health services in both modern and traditional medicines. And in a way, we could say that this constitutionalizes the age-old practice of Bhutanese government providing universal healthcare services to everyone free of cost. And I would maybe also suggest that this might have helped in also containing COVID sort of spread in Bhutan in a way. In terms of time use, there is Article 9, Section 13, which talks about the mandate that state has in ensuring the right to rest and leisure, including reasonable limitation of working hours and periodic holidays with pay. So this is directly related to the time use domains of GNH. In terms of education, Article 15 talks about the state's role in providing, Article 9, Section 15 talks about the state's role in providing education for the purpose of improving and increasing knowledge, values, and the skills of the entire population, with education being directed towards the full development of the human personality. So in terms of this may be connected to sort of capabilities approach to justice, where we look at improving what you call it, the capabilities of individuals to lead a good life through education. And education has a huge impact on how a person can develop as a human being. And in terms of cultural diversity and good governance, I already mentioned earlier, so I want to discuss it here. And moving on to community vitality, there's particular provision that is Article 9, Section 19, basically talks about the role of state or the mandate of state to promote those conditions that are conducive to cooperation in community life and integrity of the extended family structure, which again is sort of actual practice where Bhutanese live in extended family structure. And in terms of ecology diversity, I already discussed about Article 5 earlier. And when it concerns living standard, Article 9, Section 1 talks about the mandate of the state to ensure a good quality of life for the people of Bhutan. And this is connected to other domains as well. So living standard as well is sort of recognized as important values in the Constitution. And there is no specific mention about psychological well-being in the Constitution. However, there are provisions relating to well-being, in particular, for example, in Article 21, it mandates executive branch of government to ensure well-being of all citizens in Bhutan. So in a way, therefore, psychological well-being is included as important value of the Constitution as well, or it can be also considered as part of health from the perspective of mental health. Moving on to the next section of my presentation, looking at constitutionalization of environmental and ecological care in particular. When I'm talking about constitutionalization of ecological or environmental care, I'm talking about protection of environmental interest through constitutional mechanisms, particularly the protection of environment, not just for benefit of humans, but also for environment itself. So when we talk about constitutionalization of environmental care or ecological care, or some call it environmental constitutionalism, we look at generally at three factors. The first one is environmental rights approach or component, and the second one is environmental principle approach or component, and the third one is environmental duties approach or component. And under environmental rights approach, there are three subcategories. One talks about rights of environment to exist and regenerate, sort of thing, right? And the second one is citizens' right to clean and healthy environment, and third one is environmental procedural rights. In terms of Bhutanese constitution, when I read through, do the textual sort of analysis, there is no explicit mention or recognition of nature's right in the constitution. However, I argue that it can be implied from the some of the provisions of the constitutions. Looking at Article 5, Article 5 particularly requires the government to ensure a safe and healthy environment. It particularly doesn't talk about ensuring safe and healthy environment to individual citizens, but it can be construed as for nature itself as well. And there is also duty conferred upon government to protect, conserve, and improve pristine environment, and also to safeguard the biodiversity, prevent pollution and ecological degradations. And as I earlier mentioned, Article 8.2 of the Constitution confers fundamental duty upon the citizens to protect, preserve, and respect environment. So that way, if you look at duties owed, is not particularly to individual citizens. Looking at the language, it looks like duties owed it is to environment, biodiversity, and ecology. So that way, from that, we can infer that nature has sort of a right to exist and regenerate in Bhutanese constitutional context. Okay, thank you. And in terms of citizens' right to clean environment, there is also no explicit mention of citizens' right to clean environment in the Constitution, but Article 5 particularly talks about the government's duty to ensure safe and healthy environment. From there, we can construe that individual has right to clean environment. And also, if you go through National Environment Protection Act, there's particular provisions that ensure confers citizens fundamental rights to clean and healthy environment. And in terms of procedural rights, it can be construed again, and it is also included there in the National Environmental Protection Act, where it requires the state to provide information and mechanisms to participate in decision-making when it concerns environmental matters. Now, looking at the environmental principles approach, Article 5 basically talks about Bhutanese, every Bhutanese is considered as trustee of the kingdom's natural resources and environment for the benefit of the present and future generation. This basically constitutionalizes the intergenerational equity principles, and sustainability principles is there throughout, as I earlier mentioned. And we could also deduce from different provisions of the Constitution the principles such as environmental and ecological democracy and environmental and ecological justice are also included in the Constitution through inference. And in terms of environmental duties approach component, Section 5 is all about duties, conferring duties to both state and citizens, right? So this approach as well is very much included in the Constitution. Therefore, my conclusion is that Bhutan adopts all three approaches of approaches to constitutionalization of environmental care. And I'll skip this most probably and directly go to statistics. So I'll conclude with some statistics. Bhutan's forest cover as it stands right now is 83.90%. If we include shrubs as well. However, if you don't include that, excluding shrubs, we have 70.77% right now, and 51.44% from that particular percentage is already preserved as protected areas. And thanks to His Majesty the Fourth King Jigme Singye Wangchuk, since 1974 he adopted the policy that mandates 60% forest cover for all times. And now it has been constitutionalized under Article 5, which requires government to ensure that the total land of Bhutan remains under forest cover for all times to come. And we could see the result of this policy that according to latest report, in the previous year, Bhutan emitted 3.8 million tons of carbon dioxide, and the forest coverage that we have sequestered around 9.4 million tons of CO2. So that is where this the definition of carbon negative is derived from, right? So Bhutan generates lesser sort of carbon than our forest can offset the emission that are being emitted. So that's where I'll end my presentation. However, I mean, before that, maybe one point to make. Bhutan also sort of exports clean energy to neighboring countries, where it is estimated that it has sort of a capacity to absorb or offset around 17 million tons of CO2. Bhutan has done quite well in trying to ensure ecological protection and mitigating climate change effects. However, Bhutan alone can achieve the goal that set by the international organizations and international communities. And if you look at, even though Bhutan has put in lots of effort, we do experience lots of harsher climate change effects in Bhutan. For example, we are very reliant on natural resources. One example is reliance on mountain glaciers that contributes to generation of clean energy through hydropower projects. And with climate change, global warming, we have issues of fast melting of those glacier fans and also bursting of glacier sleds that creates havoc downstream, creating lots of challenges for people's livelihood. So these are some of the impacts that Bhutan is going through right now. I think with this, I'll conclude, and I look forward to discussion. Thank you. Kadichel.
Thank you very much, Nima, for that very interesting presentation. I think it was a very good follow-up to what Ken said about sort of the alternative development model and the way you kind of showed how all the pillars and the domains get incorporated in the Constitution. I also thought it was very interesting how you focused on kind of the rights and duties, and you can see how implicitly perhaps, but so many dimensions of climate change and human rights are very much present in the Constitution. So I really do look forward to Q&A session where we can discuss some of these things in more detail. But moving on, I would now like to invite Mr. Navraj Chhetri to share his presentation with us. Over to you, Navraj.
Yeah, thank you, Loveleen, for this wonderful introduction and welcome. I would like to thank the earlier speakers for setting the context. Then it makes my presentation a little easier because I'll not repeat some of the points already mentioned in the interest of time, so that we have more time for Q&A and discussion. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone attending this symposium. I would like to thank University of Essex for inviting me as a panel member to share experiences from Bhutan. And I feel this is an opportunity to learn from distinguished panel members and participants. This event is timely when countries are preparing for COP26, Conference of Parties 26, to be held at Glasgow and working on greener recovery. This is a gist of what I'll be mentioning about. I'll be touching on brief background, but most has already been covered, so I'll skip some of the points. The climate vulnerability, the impacts, the action on the ground where we are engaged actively, the policy screening, which Dr. Kent did mention about the policy screening tool, which I'll skip so that we'll have more time for other discussion. I'll end with conclusion. So when it comes to brief background, these details have already been shown. Bhutan, being a small nation, earlier had difficulty in convincing or informing people where Bhutan is located. But now with the image of being a climate champion, Bhutan has been able to advocate or showcase some of the best practices in addition to the GNH philosophy we advocate on. The population has already been informed, the forest cover. So what I'll mention now is about the terrain. So we have it's quite a diverse terrain. So it starts from 200 to 7,000 meters above sea level. So you can see the diverse nature. So this is to talk about the vulnerability. How are we rated in terms of vulnerability? So I'll talk about some external agencies. United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change identifies countries with mountainous ecosystem as among the most vulnerable in Article 4.8. And Bhutan, being in the Himalayan range, we are vulnerable. And similarly, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change assessment reports points to number of vulnerabilities that mountainous countries face, including their size and limited resource gap. In addition to it, just to give more data, the Notre Dame Global Adaptation Initiative, which ranks different countries. In fact, there are 181 countries. Bhutan is ranked 91 in terms of vulnerability. So this is to set the context why Bhutan is vulnerable. So I'll talk about reasons for vulnerability. So I talked about the external institution who has rated or classified Bhutan as vulnerable. But now, what are the reasons that makes us much more vulnerable? So firstly, given its geographical region, that's why I was mentioning about the altitude, the variation, and mountainous terrain, Bhutan is particularly vulnerable to climate change, with variation in the timing, frequency, and intensity of rainfall, leading to runoff and erosion. There is high dependence on climate-sensitive sectors, such as hydropower and agriculture, which are directly impacted by climate change. The hydropower contributes to 12.71% of GDP. Around 57% of the population is dependent on agriculture, whereas less than 3% of the total area is arable. So this is something to note. The climate change has major impact on the livelihood of people working in this sector. Bhutan, being a LDC country, has very limited coping capacity to build the resilience of people and infrastructure. So these are some of the reasons why Bhutan is vulnerable. And you could see from the pictures here, the terrain, some of the hydropowers, and the land where people are working. So now, having talked about the reason for vulnerability, now how does it impact us? The studies indicate that glaciers in high mountain regions are experiencing accelerated retreat rate. Bhutan recorded 567 glacial lakes, of which 17 are potentially dangerous. So this picture shows people engage in artificially lowering the Thothormi Lake, which is one of the lake in northern part of Bhutan, lake by 5 meters in 2010 to avert the risk from glacial lake outburst flood. And to continue, this is an article from one of the newspaper reporting on landslide. This is a recurrent problem leading to communities and districts being cut off due to landslide during monsoon. The rainfall pattern is changing with higher intensity, leading to more frequent landslides and floods. The water sector in Bhutan has been impacted like other sectors. There are evidences of water sources drying up due to rise in temperature, as well as due to longer dry seasons. The study conducted by one of the institutes found out that 35% of water sources out of 6,555 are drying up, while 2% have dried up. Similarly, there has been increase in incidences of wind and thunderstorms, as per the data maintained by the National Center for Hydrology and Meteorology, which is the nodal agency for generation of information and delivery of products and services on weather, climate, cytosphere, and water resources. Windstorm destroys crops of farmers, including damages to the houses. Similarly, the farming communities lose their produce to pests and diseases. Then the number of forest fire is on the rise, which is mainly triggered by hotter and longer dry season. And having said all of those vulnerability and the situation on ground, now I'll talk about what are we doing in order to build the capacity of the local communities and working with the government. So the first framework what we use while developing plans and policies is the gross national happiness. So these are the 4 pillars as showed by earlier speakers. So this is the founding reference we always look at. The second, as you all must be aware, the 2030 agenda adopted in September 2015 by the General Assembly for Sustainable Development shows the pathway for countries while pursuing development activities. It includes 17 sustainable goals. Building on the principle of leaving no one behind, the new agenda emphasizes a holistic approach to achieving sustainable development for all. Then the Paris Agreement that was adopted by 196 parties during the Conference of Parties 21 in Paris in 2015 guides the country's journey towards green development. Its goal is to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees, preferably to 1.5 degrees Celsius. This forms the basis for countries while formulating the nationally determined contributions. Finally, the 5-year plans spearheaded by Gross National Happiness Commission would indicate the priorities of various sectors. To cite, there is a specific national key result area on carbon neutrality, climate and disaster resilient in line with Bhutan's commitment to remain carbon neutral. The first intervention now I'd like to talk about is stabilizing the landslide, because I did mention that these are recurring problems. So through one of our projects, what we helped or developed this is the area crossing the Thimphu-Phuntsling Highway, which is the main artery for transporting essential imports from India, including food, oil, and medicines, was sinking due to landslides. In order to stabilize the critical area, a newer and innovative solution such as soil nailing technology, complemented by bioengineering, were tested in 2018. So if you see the slides here, this shows the pictures of the landslide, and it was quite a massive, and if there was a landslide, this would have disrupted or disconnected the northern part of Bhutan, where a lot of the import come from the south, and if this would have disrupted. And looking at the experience from this, one of the current project we are working on, we are trying to build similar kind of doing firstly with the studies, build some of the solutions in the 3 critical landslide areas. So at the moment, we are conducting the geotechnical studies, and hopefully we'll see a similar success stories in future. And the second part we worked on is having a right information, timely information was very important. So through one of the project, we felt that having this automated hydrobed stations in the field was important, so that the NCHM I talked about, the nodal agency, would get the information, real-time information for better planning and forecasting. So through this project, they were able to establish 100+ stations across Bhutan. So what has happened is it has enhanced the capability of the agency to forecast. They give 3 days a week. So now what we are doing is, these are okay for national and district level, but what is this of value to the local communities who are waiting to receive information for right time for harvesting or for any agricultural activities. So we are going a step ahead through one of our projects to see how can we take this national and sub-national data to farmers for informed and climate-informed planning and decision making. And recently, we are fortunate, coinciding with the World Environment Day on 5th June, Her Majesty the Queen of Bhutan launched the second nationally determined contributions ahead of COP26. It reiterates the Bhutan's carbon neutral commitments as pledged during Conference of Parties in 2015. It charts a path for enhancing mitigation targets and actions through sectoral low-emission development strategies in transport, industry, food security, and human settlement. Then continuing with some of the action, I talked about some of the issue related to water sector. To combat it, we are having this National Adaptation Plan Readiness project, which will help to understand the impact of water sector in medium to long term. Having this important information will help Bhutan to develop appropriate measures to minimize the risk. And in order to leverage financing, the various funding mechanism, including international and domestic financing, is being considered. The accelerator lab is being set up to quickly test newer and better solutions. Moving on, we are currently implementing this electric mobility project with government. Here, the objective is to replace 300 fossil-based cars to electric one. The project is working on enabling policy and infrastructure to make it affordable for drivers. To continue, we are most of our, or 99%, more than 99% of our energy is generated through hydropower. So in order to diversify the energy sources, we are piloting 180 kilowatt solar power, which is being integrated with wind power project. So this is going to demonstrate the technical viability as well as diversify the source of energy generation in the long run. And to promote energy efficiency, a roadmap was developed highlighting the priority areas for implementation. And in the waste segment, we are already working on ways to change the behavior of people through this BI concept and see how best we could educate people to minimize the waste they generate. This slide I had prepared to show the screening process, but I'll not talk about the process itself, but I'll touch on the climate change policy because this is linked to how we are aligned in terms of addressing the issues related to climate change. So we did support in the past to develop this climate change policy. The goal is to provide strategic guidance to ensure that Bhutan remains carbon neutral and protects the well-being of the people of Bhutan by adapting to climate change in an efficient and effective manner. It has two policy objectives: pursue carbon neutral development. As earlier speaker said, we are carbon negative, and we are helping to maintain that status unless we have this kind of interventions in place. So there could be a situation where we could exceed the mitigation, which would lead us not being a carbon neutral country. So we are working in line with all the ministries to see that we still maintain the emission so that we have this we are within the sequestration capacity. So building resilience to climate change, as mentioned earlier, Bhutan being mountainous country, we have very limited option than to cope up with climate change. So building the resilience is one obvious reason, or the ways to adapt to the changing situation. So I'll skip this protocol on the policy formulation. This has clearly been explained by Dr. Kent. With this, I wanted to say some of the concluding remark. With this current pandemic, no doubt has created global disruption, but it has also given an opportunity to prioritize greener recovery. To cite, Bhutan is pursuing ecotourism that is in line with the tourism policy of high value, low impact. The other important aspects to consider is circular economy aimed at limiting waste by reusing and recycling. Lastly, I would like to end by saying that climate change is a global phenomenon. We can fight only if we all join hands and work in harmony. So with this, thank you. And these are some of the contact details of my office and some the Twitter links of office and mine LinkedIn and Twitter account. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Navraj. Again, that was very interesting in terms of understanding the vulnerability and impacts of climate change in Bhutan, and also how you talked about action on the ground, both in terms of policy formulation and implementation, while linking sort of a mainstream development model like sustainable development and GNH. And was interesting to see sort of the connections between what Kent described and Nima's sort of contextualization of GNH in the Constitution to your sort of very real actions on the ground. So while I see that there is already a question in the Q&A box, but I'm going to use and abuse my power as the chair to ask each of you a question, if that's all right, and then we will take up the questions that are in the box. So I suppose my first question, I'll start with Kent. Kent, that was really, really interesting. And I was reflecting on what you said about the feasibility of replicability and the importance of adapting to cultural values in other jurisdictions. But you also were mentioning how local cultural values were the foundation of the GNH in Bhutan itself. And I wondered what your thoughts were about how those values might be evolving in response to kind of the international global perspectives on the threat of climate change, responses to climate change, and understanding of human rights. because you particularly highlighted the very Buddhist values that underpin, some of those contexts. So I was wondering what you thought of changes that might happen domestically in the understanding of GNH over time.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think it's important to note that values aren't static, right? Values change, they may be slow to change, but they're certainly not static. I think there's two things, that have implications for climate change, maybe not directly related, but two things that have come up in my own research about the nature of values that underlie GNH and the potential for evolution in those values. And one is I think the impact of maybe sort of a global consumer culture. And I think, people in Bhutan that I've talked to over the last decade or so often will talk about this concern as Bhutan was largely closed to the outside world until 1960s. And as it's opened up and as it's embraced sort of the positive aspects of globalization, I think there's also a concern about values that are coming from abroad that might undermine some of those things I spoke about, in particular consumerist values, which has implications for waste and pollution and all that sort of thing. And so there is a concern that there is a move to more potentially consumerist values that underlie perhaps a younger generation of Bhutanese. The second one area I think is quite interesting of potential value change, and I think that has come with democratization. And I think the process of democratic transition, so the creation of the constitution that's been spoken about today, that is part of a larger process of democratic transition. And it was I think a really unique and very interesting process of democratic transition in that it was driven by His Majesty the Fourth King. It's not often that democracy comes from above, but here you have a king who is pursuing democratization. And I think what my own research has shown is, I think quite rightly, is people with democratization, people have taken on a greater role in raising their voices, in participating in the democratic process. And I think that's particularly, that's a great indication of, I think, good governance evolving in Bhutan. But what some people have indicated to me in my research, some Bhutanese have indicated that there's a concern that increased voice may undermine promotion of conservation and those sorts of things, as people sort of try to balance the economic component of GNH with the ecological component of GNH. And this is particularly the case around something called human-wildlife conflict, where you have the success of conservation has been so fantastic. You have, there's flourishing forests and a lot of animals in these forests who are now attacking farmers' fields and, destroying crops and entire crops in a single night. And so there's some concern that there's pushback, that people's livelihoods are being destroyed, and that they're going to take steps that are sort of go against the conservation ethic. And so there's a sense that democracy might sort of facilitate that process of bringing conflict between conservation and economic activity. So I think those are sort of two areas of potential value change, one driven by democracy, one driven by sort of globalization and consumerism, that may shift values in ways that have implications for conservation and for climate issues.
Thanks very much for that, Kent. I think I agree with you. There is this kind of question or sort of about dynamism of values and how that affects our relationship with sort of laws and policies. Nima, I had a couple of questions for you, and I also see a couple of questions for you in the chat. So I'm going to pose my questions first, and then also add the question in the chat. You were mentioning about the health dimension, and it's interesting that you mentioned COVID and how, the fact that there is sort of universal free healthcare has helped the country kind of manage the crises. And I was just wondering if you could reflect more on what COVID-19 might mean for sort of the constitutional understanding of GNH, particularly in the context of climate change and human rights. Do you expect any kind of shifts? Again, kind of going back to the point about dynamism of values, do you think there is the possibility of any shifts, or is it not such a big concern? And my other question was kind of around the hierarchy, because I understand that some of the relevant constitutional provisions in terms of the models and pillars is in terms of directive principles of state policy or principles of state policy. So I wondered whether there is any kind of hierarchy or prioritization within the constitution of the different domains of GNH. And I'm just going to go ahead and add two questions from the chat, and you can take them in any order you like. One is from Catherine, who's asking whether you can explain how the 2008 Constitution was drafted and those values were selected. And she also says, did the constitution drafting process involve ordinary people's participation? And then we also have another question from Magda, who asks whether you think it is feasible for other countries to implement the Bhutan model. So I'm going to leave you with this whole bunch of questions, and you can decide how you wish to answer them.
Thank you so much for quite a lot of questions. I don't know if I would be able to do justice to all those questions. I'll start with your questions, particularly on the COVID and GNH and constitution sort of a relationship, particularly on the issue of shift. I don't see any major issues regarding that, but what we have seen right now during the COVID-19 situation is that GNH in action, particularly from the constitutional perspective. If you look at universal healthcare, did help in a way to, for example, like people coming forward to do a COVID test, because the test kits are free, you don't have to pay. So there are lots of people coming forward, and that in a way help contain COVID spread in Bhutan. And when we talk, it's not just about merely about health. If you look at good governance, there are sort of indicators that includes providing services to citizens and also ensuring what you call it good government performance. And we have seen this through COVID-19 situation where GNH is really put into action, where our leadership stood test of time, and they were willing to what you call it serve people in better ways, including His Majesty himself is right now in East, making sure that COVID protocols are being implemented well, so that COVID-19 spread is being reduced. Where right now many what you call it southern borders are under lockdown due to COVID-19. So that way, I think our leadership, we could see really standing up to the GNH values that are there. And in terms of community vitality as well, if you look at many people are coming forward as volunteer to help government in containing COVID-19 spread. So if you look at, so those are principles that are there in the constitution as well, and these are directly coming from GNH as sort of values and principles of GNH, and it is being now implemented in practical sense, and we are seeing that right now. In terms of hierarchies, I agree that there are sort of hierarchies in constitution. The state policies are not really considered as sort of what do you call it, a justiciable sort of rights there. But if you look at, in particular, if you look at health and education, at least providing education up to 10 standard is constitutional mandate that's there. And even if it is clubbed under state policy, the language used is state shall. So rest are like state shall strive to, endeavor to, right? But in terms of health and education usage, state shall provide basic health services of both traditional and what you call it, modern medicine. So if you look at that, there are some provisions, even if it's put under state principle, state policies that can be implemented or can be interpreted as justiciable rights. So these are there. And in terms of the questions from Q&A, particularly on Catherine's question, I think that would entail a separate presentation in itself. So it's a huge question. And talking about the process of drafting constitution, I think we need to go beyond that and try to understand historically how the political systems developed in Bhutan, in particular from the 1972 until adoption of constitution, particularly because it was His Majesty, the fourth king, who initiated the drafting of what you call a drafting process of constitution. And even before initiation of drafting process, he was already preparing for democracy in a sense. He was already decentralizing the powers by creating local governance and others, right? and also devolving power to executive governments and others. So there were huge, reforms, institutional reforms that were already brought before adoption of constitutions, including anti-corruption commissions and establishment of election commissions and others. So he was already preparing for this process. And specifically concerning drafting process, the 39-member drafting committee was instituted, and we had representatives directly elected by people from 20 different districts. And we had representatives from parliament and central monastic body and from judiciary and from other ministries as well. And moving particularly on choice of values, it was sort of the drafting committee was purely national sort of a drafting committee, and we didn't have sort of a external consultant that was doing drafting for us. And that way, I think that gave sort of a way for drafting committees to look at Buddhist values, traditional values, and others, including GNH values, particularly because GNH was instituted or founded even before adoption of constitution. It was adopted since 1970s. So those values were taken into consideration, and that's how those values made into constitution. Now moving on to the second questions put by Catherine on whether ordinary people were involved or not. So in the direct drafting sort of a thing, it wasn't. But if you look at their majesties went to all districts and met with people. So we call it a consultative process that was done. So they had come up with the drafting committee came up with a constitution draft, and that was shared to all households in Bhutan, and His Majesty's, including accompanied by the chairperson of the drafting committee, went to 20 Songkhos and consulted with all the people in different Songkhos. That way, we could say that there were huge participation from ordinary people as well in making of the constitution. So I think there was sort of a third question somewhere. So you want me to answer the
there's a question about looking at sort of the feasibility of the GNH model in other places. And this question from Magda, if you could answer that.
Okay. I think a GNH model as a package may not be feasible to all the countries, right? So, but if you look at other values, for example, sustainability principles, environmental protections, and others are already there in the international arena, where also Navraj did talk about it, including sustainable development goals are very relevant. And if you look at, there were also sort of National Assembly resolutions on adopting happiness as sort of at least not as the goal, but as one of the goal which would contribute to sustainable development. So I think there could be sort of relevance, and I did see sort of I think there's something similar in Canada as well. It doesn't talk about happiness as such, but there is 7 principles or something that is quite similar to, I don't exactly remember the term, but something similar to Bhutan's 9 domains approach. So that I remember reading somewhere. So yeah, I think it could be relevant to any countries, but it may not be as a full package, but otherwise, thank you so much.
Thanks, Nima, for all those answers. It's really interesting how the importance of sort of values, strong institutions, and kind of, linking the different stages of policies, formulation, implementation, evaluation seems so key to this understanding. Now, Raj, I come to you now, and for you also, the question which is in the Q&A box about the feasibility of the GNH model for other jurisdictions would be one question. And then I want to just tag along my own question to that. It was really interesting that you talked about both policy formulation and policy implementation. And also the fact that you talked about kind of these, sort of more conventional sustainable development understanding, but then also linking it to, the GNH toolkit, talking about the GNH Commission. And I was just wondering whether in your sort of practical experience, you sometimes notice a tension between the GNH concept, which is based, on the foundation of values and, particular values, and say a more universal general notion of sustainable development. Do you come across any of that tension in the projects that you undertake? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for these questions. When it comes to feasibility of GNH model, as rightly mentioned by earlier speakers, there are some tools which are quite similar to this GNH model, and that helps them to assess the happiness level of the various countries they rank, depending on that. My submission here is there are a lot of elements that could be replicated because this concerns how people interact with the different aspects, the ecosystem, and one question was about the human dignity. And GNH is all about human dignity, human at the core of the development philosophy. So it's about empowering people and ensuring that how a person interacts with nature, how do we benefit through the nature. So it's about coexisting with the system. So how we generate this co-benefit through this, and GNHC advocates on that. When you talk about policy and implementation, and I did mention about some of the framework we use while developing it, so far there has not been much of issues, and we also help to see how much of the indicators align to the SDG indicators. So that way we have seen very close relationship or integration with the GNH indicator and SDG indicator. These were some of the assessment that was done in the past. So I just wanted to mention about this. Thank you.
Thanks very much for your responses, Navraj. I also wanted to kind of open up that last question about the understanding of human dignity as a GNH value. I wonder whether either Kent or Nima or both would like to react to that question.
Sure, I can give a brief response. I mean, I think Naraj covered it very well. I think that was a clear understanding of human dignity as empowering individuals within their societal context and within their connection to nature. And I think, and I speak of this based on research as well, because obviously I exist in a different cultural context and a different set of values, but based on some research I've done, when Bhutanese will talk about dignity, it's also about sort of the inherent dignity of all sentient beings. So not just humans. So it's a broader sense of all sentient beings having dignity, and that we are interconnected through that.
Thanks for that, Kent. Nima, anything to add to this concept of human dignity? Because I know you talked about the rights of nature itself in the Constitution, which I think is really interesting.
Yeah, I think when we are talking about GNH, I don't know if my friends or any Bhutanese who subscribe to what I have in my mind. But when I talk about GNH, if you look at Article 5, it talks about protecting environment and ensuring sort of what do you call it, prevention of ecological degradation. And if you look at that, then we are also talking about the dignity of environment itself, right? So nature of what do you call it, natural environment. As Dr. Kent talked about sentient beings, right? We believe that mountains and rivers and lakes are inhabited by sentient, or what do you call it, different sentient beings, including deities. So therefore, we could say that nature itself has sort of a dignity. So we're not talking about human dignity, but also talking about dignity of nature, exist and regenerate, right? So not depleting to the extent that it cannot, regenerate. And I like the concept of so I did talk about briefly about capabilities approach to justice. When you talk about that, we're not just talking about human dignity, but also talking about non-humans' dignity to live in harmony with humans as well, right? So it's all about this. So in a way, I think that dignity is not just about human dignity, but also GNH, particularly when we talk about living in harmony with nature, we're talking about dignity of both natural environment as well as us humans. So that's what I has to add to what two other speakers has already said. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Nima. I think it's a really sort of interesting idea, both from obviously a human rights perspective, where we've been talking so much about the right to life and dignity as a part of the right to life in certain jurisdictions like India, where I come from, and whether that extends to nature. So it's really interesting to see this, and also the connection with values and cultural values and how that informs these constitutional understandings. And of course, in a climate change context, all of this begins to make a lot of sense, because if we are talking about, for example, a precautionary approach, and we're not yet able to make those direct connections to the human sort of form, I think there's many interesting points to be made from that expansive understanding of dignity. Thanks so much for answering those questions. We have a couple of minutes more, so if anybody wants to add any questions to the Q&A chat, please do. And while that's happening, maybe I can just ask a question to all of you, but this is more about policy evaluation, because we've talked about policy formulation, we've talked about policy implementation, but I was wondering whether you had any thoughts on what kind of policy evaluation mechanisms are there to ensure that the concept is truly being operationalized and is effective, if you like.
I don't know if I should.
Yes, please, Nima, go ahead.
If you look at right now, I think GNH is sort of integrated into a 5-year plan and annual work plan of ministries, agencies, and that are tied to individual performance of particular organizations and ministries. And these are being reviewed, and we have sort of a annual work plan, midterm review and annual review sort of a thing, looking at whether those targets are met or not. I think that is done also through GNHC. So in a way, there are robust sort of monitoring and evolution mechanisms put in place. So I don't know if Dr. Ken has anything to add on this.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I think one of the things that I find very interesting of these GNH tools and this GNH framework is that they are so clearly infused into things like the 5-year plan and other sort of mechanisms. I think, you mentioned in Canada something similar. We have something called the Canadian Index of Wellbeing, I believe it's called, which is a similar kind of index to the GNH index. But it's not an official part of public policy. It's not used in the way that Bhutan uses the GNH index. And so you have an index in Bhutan, again, where they carry out a survey every 5 years, and then that can be used to evaluate policies, I think, quite effectively, and how policies are fostering those 9 domains of GNH. So, in my mind, Bhutan is, I think, ahead of the rest of us in terms of actually applying these kinds of tools to things like policy evaluation through the GNH index. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you so very much. We are almost out of time, which is great. So we've had a really interesting bunch of presentations. Thank you so very much for the presentations to all the speakers. Thank you for your questions. I hope this is interesting. I learned a lot from the session, and I have an even longer list of questions which I might follow each one of you up with. But thank you so very much for accepting this invitation and joining us.
I think looks like she froze.
I think, yeah, we lost her.
It looks like we've lost Loveleen there, unfortunately. Maybe she'll come back now. but obviously Loveleen was just wrapping up the session, and on Loveleen's behalf and on behalf of the university and the other organisers, I want to extend my great thanks for this wonderful session. It's been so informative. It's been so insightful and inspiring. And thank you for all the responses to the very interesting questions, and to the guests that have people attending. Thank you for the interesting questions, for your and for attending this session. And I think unfortunately Loveleen has left. Loveleen is there. Loveleen, I'm not sure if Loveleen is coming back, but I think we'll have to close the session now. So thank you very much to everybody, and goodbye for now.